Let's start with a very basic video of .NET. What is IL code, CTS, CLR, CLS, and JIT. These are all very basic terminologies. I'm sure that people who are working with .NET every day, right? They must be coming across these terminologies in everyday life. So let's understand what all these 4 or 5 vocabularies actually mean. Now, before I go ahead and I talk about these vocabularies, let's go ahead and see a simple PowerPoint presentation here, or let's first try to understand how exactly a .NET code compiles and runs. So what happens? Step 1, your developer or the developer actually writes the code in his favorite language. Must be C#, must be VB.NET, must be VC++.NET, or whatever it is. Okay. And the respective compilers, that is, for example, for C# it is csc.exe, for VB.NET it is vbc.exe, will compile the code into a half compiled code, okay, which is called as the IL code. Now this IL code is nothing but it's an intermediate language code, which is partially compiled. Okay. Now this IL code is, when you want to execute this IL code on the machine, right, what happens is your .NET framework has something called as CLR, the common language runtime. The common language runtime pulls himself. It takes this half compiled code and gives it to something called as the JIT. Now the JIT is nothing but it's called the just-in-time compiler. The just-in-time compiler basically reads every line of the IL code and compiles it to platform-specific instructions. In other words, it compiles it to a binary format, which the machine can execute. Remember that a machine cannot execute this half compiled or partially compiled code, right? So the JIT actually goes line by line. As the application runs, it takes each line and compiles it to a machine-specific or a platform-specific instruction, and then later on this instruction is executed. So you write your code in your language. The language compiles your code into a half or a partially compiled code or a half compiled code called as the IL code. The CLR, which is the heart of your .NET engine, actually takes up this IL code, gives it to the JIT, and then JIT compiles it to a platform specific instruction, and then these instructions are executed, and in that way your application is executed, right? So now that we have understood basically how a simple .NET application is compiled and executed, now let's go and go into each of these vocabularies, and let's try to understand each of these vocabularies. So now that we understood how exactly a .NET application runs, or how exactly a .NET application is compiled and executed, let's try to go through each of these vocabularies. So IL code is nothing but it's a partially compiled code, it's a half compiled code, it's a CPU independent partially half compiled code. Okay. Now the next question, as a developer you must be thinking is that why do we need a partially compiled code? Why not the full machine compiled code? Because again there's an extra process which the execution engine has to do in order to compile this code into a full compiled code. Now what happens is when we run the .NET application, right, we do not know what kind of environment we are going to run on. In other words, we do not know it's going to be Windows XP, it's going to be Windows 7, it's going to be a Windows Server, etc. So in other words, we do not know the CPU configuration, we do not know the machine configuration, the security configuration. So what the .NET platform has done is that whenever you write a code, right, it just compiles it to a half compiled code. And on runtime, this code is compiled as per the machine specific instruction, as per the machine specific environmental properties. So it reads and says, okay, this machine is basically, or this CPU has Windows 2003 or Windows Server running on it. So basically, this is the optimized code for it, or the compiled optimized machine specific code for it. So that's why the IL code is left open-ended, until the execution is done. The next important concept is a CLR, or the common language runtime. We have already seen, when we talked about the execution of .NET code, where the CLR's main work was to take the IL code and give it to the JIT. But other than that, there are 4 primary important things that CLR does. First is garbage collection. The second and third is code access and code verification, and the last one is IL to native translation, where it basically gives the IL code to the JIT. Now garbage collection means basically when your .NET application runs, there is a lot of objects which are created, and at given moment of time it's possible that you do not need these objects. So garbage collection is nothing but it's a small routine, or it's a small background process, which background process thread which runs and sees that what kind of objects your application is not using currently, and basically reclaims the memory of those objects. Code access and code verification is nothing but basically, where the CLR sees that what kind of rights and what kind of authority this code has, or is this code having some kind of code which is dangerous to not be allowed to be running on an operating system. So those kind of checks are done on code access, security, and code verification. And final one, CLR basically gives this IL code to JIT to ensure that the code is fully compiled and it can run as per the platform. So in other words, CLR is nothing but it's the heart of the .NET framework, because if you see these activities, these activities are very important activities to run your code. The next important concept is the CTS, that is a common type systems. Now, if you see .NET, right, there are various languages in .NET like C#, VB.NET, Visual Fox Pro, VC++. Now, there can be situations, where you would like to use the code of one language into the other language. Right. So in order to ensure that there is a smooth communication, between these languages, we have something called as a common type system. So what happens is that when you compile a code in C# or when you compile a code in VB.NET, at the end of the day, the data type of these languages gets compiled to a common type system. And because of this, you can call a code of one language into other language. The next important concept is CLS. That is common language specification. CLS is a specification, or it's a set of rules or guidelines, when any programming language, when I say programming language, I'm saying about the .NET programming language, when it follows, right, it will ensure that that code can be consumed in any .NET compliant language. So for example, let's say that you have written a code in C#, and you want to ensure that there should not be any problems when VB.NET consumes this code, or when Visual Fox Pro consumes this code. Then what you have to ensure is that you have to ensure that you are following common language specification. Because remember that there are a lot of code in C#, which can make your code non-compliant, and it's possible that VB.NET will not be able to call it. For example, C# is case sensitive, while VB.NET is not case sensitive. So if you define, let's say, two variables, with the same name, but with the type case sensitive, with a difference of only case sensitive, right, the VB.NET code will not be able to consume it. So in other words, CLS is nothing but it's a specification. It's a set of guidelines, which ensures that, if your programming language follows, it can be consumed by any .NET language. In the further coming parts of the videos, we'll see a sample demonstration of CLS. We'll violate a CLS rule, and we'll see that how exactly, the CLS compliancy and the non-compliancy actually works. Now, the final vocabulary is JIT. JIT is nothing but the just-in-time compiler. It's the internal compiler of .NET, which basically compiles your partially half-compiled code into a machine-specific instruction so that it can be executed. So if you remember, when we talked about the .NET compilation and execution, the JIT actually reads the IL code, the half-compiled code, and basically converts them to a platform-specific instruction. So now that we have gone through these vocabularies, what we'll do is, for each of these vocabularies, we'll try to understand in depth with some practical demos how each of these vocabularies are actually connected with .NET. So what we'll do is, we'll do a sample demonstration of seeing the IL code. We'll do a sample demonstration of how the CTS looks like. We'll do a sample demonstration of how the CLS looks like. So in the further coming videos, we'll see more demonstrations, to understand these terminologies in a better manner.